The seeds of the Israel-Iran conflict were not sown in hatred, but in surprising alliance. When Israel was founded in 1948, Iran, then under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became one of the first Muslim-majority countries to recognize it, albeit unofficially. For decades, the two nations maintained behind-the-scenes relations, driven by oil, military cooperation, and a mutual alignment with Western interests. But everything changed in 1979 with Iran's Islamic Revolution, the overthrow of the Shah, and the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini marked a radical ideological shift. Iran transformed from a monarchy allied with the West into a theocratic regime that viewed Israel not just as a rival, but as an existential evil. Khomeini called Israel the Little Satan, second only to the United States, the Great Satan. This transformation wasn't just political, it was deeply religious. Iran's Shia leadership saw the Palestinian cause as a sacred duty, while Israel, increasingly threatened by Arab nationalist and Islamist movements, began seeing Iran as the primary sponsor of terrorism in the region. The rhetoric hardened. Iran declared support for armed resistance, and Israel branded Iran as its most dangerous enemy. The rivalry became embedded in each nation's national identity. Israel as the democratic outpost in a hostile region, and Iran as the revolutionary Islamic power determined to challenge Western imperialism and liberate Jerusalem, unable to fight directly due to geographic separation and the risk of global fallout. Israel and Iran descended into a shadow war, one fought through proxies, covert operations, assassinations, and cyber attacks. Iran built a network of influence stretching from Iraq to Lebanon, known as the Shia Crescent. Its crown jewel was Hezbollah, a militant group and political force based in Lebanon that emerged in the 1980s. Iran funded and trained Hezbollah, which has since launched numerous attacks on Israel and acted as Tehran's frontline deterrent. In Gaza, Iran backed Hamas and Islamic Jihad, fueling Israel's fears of encirclement. Israel, on the other hand, launched a calculated campaign of disruption. It reportedly assassinated multiple Iranian nuclear scientists, bombed weapons convoys in Syria, and infiltrated Iranian intelligence networks. One of the most notable cyber attacks in history, the Stuxnet worm, which sabotaged Iranian centrifuge, was believed to be an Israeli-American operation. The civil war in Syria further entangled the two powers. Iran used the chaos to entrench its military presence near Israel's borders, while Israel launched hundreds of airstrikes to stop Iranian weapons shipments to Hezbollah. Syria became a silent battlefield, an unacknowledged war zone, where Israeli jets flew undeterred and Iranian operatives dug in deeper. Meanwhile, Israel began forming new alliances with Gulf states like the UAE and Bahrain through the Abraham Accords, further isolating Iran. For Iran, this was a red flag. It confirmed that Arab regimes were aligning with its sworn enemy. Tensions escalated, and so did the scope of the Cold Conflict. The shadow war was no longer in the shadows. It was playing out across air, sea, cyberspace, and ideology. And every move brought the two nations closer to the edge. By the early 2020s, the Cold War between Israel and Iran was already boiling. But what kept full-scale war at bay were red lines, invisible boundaries neither side dared to cross. Iran insisted it had the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. Israel, however, saw any path toward a nuclear bomb as a direct threat to its survival. The result was a long standoff, defined by warnings, threats, and the occasional explosion in a remote Iranian facility. But the red lines began to blur. Iran increased its uranium enrichment to 60% purity, dangerously close to weapons grade. The International Atomic Energy Agency raised alarms, while Israel sent a blunt message: we will not allow Iran to become a nuclear state. Meanwhile, Iran's ballistic missile program advanced, and its militias in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen grew bolder. Israeli cargo ships were attacked in the Red Sea. Mysterious explosions rocked nuclear and military sites in Iran. The war wasn't declared, but it was happening bit by bit. Tension spiked further when Israeli airstrikes in Syria killed high-ranking Iranian officers. Iran retaliated with drone swarms, cyber attacks on Israeli infrastructure, and attempts to target Israeli embassies worldwide. The final straw came in the form of miscalculation, or perhaps a carefully calculated provocation, an assassination of a top Iranian general, possibly linked to Israeli intelligence, shocked Tehran. The regime, under pressure at home and enraged abroad, vowed revenge. The red lines had been crossed. The long-feared open conflict was now reality. The Middle East woke up to chaos. Iran launched a series of direct missile strikes on Israeli military sites, a first. It was no longer operating through Hezbollah or Hamas. It was Iran. Hedon. Sirens wailed across Tel Aviv and Haifa. Air defenses intercepted many, but some struck targets. Israeli civilians were wounded. The nation felt war on its own soil. Israel responded with overwhelming force. Jet squadrons flew deep into Iranian airspace, targeting nuclear facilities in Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. The world watched in horror as satellite images showed mushrooming plumes of smoke rising from the Iranian desert. But Iran wasn't alone. Hezbollah opened the northern front, unleashing thousands of rockets on northern Israel. Iranian-backed militias in Syria and Iraq fired missiles into the Golan Heights. Israeli Arabs rioted in mixed cities. Chaos spread. The Strait of Hormuz, vital oil artery, became a battlefield. Iranian naval units harassed oil tankers, pushing oil prices to historic highs. Global markets spiraled into panic. Energy crises gripped Europe and Asia. The U.S. scrambled, torn between defending its ally Israel and avoiding World War III. Aircraft carriers were deployed to the Gulf, while factional diplomacy with Qatar and Oman tried to de-escalate. But on the ground, it was a full-blown regional war. Iran's regime used the war to rally nationalist support at home, but protests still broke out. In Israel, reserve units were called up, shelters overflowed. The Iron Dome was pushed to its limits. This wasn't a war of words or cyberweapons anymore. It was open, hot conflict with two ancient civilizations now locked in a modern apocalypse, and neither side looked ready to back down. The world couldn't look away. The Israel-Iran war had pulled back the curtain on what a true 21st century regional war looked like: airstrikes, cyber attacks, economic sabotage, mass propaganda, and real-time drone warfare. But the shockwave wasn't limited to the Middle East. It went global fast. The United States faced an impossible choice. Israel, its closest ally in the region, was under attack. But a full-scale intervention risked triggering a much larger war with Russia and China, who, though not openly allied with Iran, warned against any aggression toward Tehran. American bases in Iraq and the Gulf were already being targeted by Iranian-backed militias. The U.S. deployed reinforcements, but also pressed for ceasefire talks through backchannels in Oman and Switzerland. Europe trembled. Oil prices had surged past $200 a barrel. Fuel shortages hit hard. Protests broke out in Paris, Berlin, and London, demanding governments stay neutral. Still, NATO members met in emergency session as Israeli cities burned and Iranian power stations exploded. A wider war looked terrifyingly possible. The Gulf Arab states, many of whom had normalized ties with Israel under the Abraham Accords, suddenly found themselves in the crossfire. Dubai's skyline darkened as airlines shut down operations. Saudi Arabia, long a rival of Iran, held emergency talks with China, trying to cool the flames. Turkey tried to act as mediator. So did Egypt, but diplomacy couldn't keep up with missiles, and on the ground, the human cost was staggering. In Lebanon, entire towns emptied as Hezbollah's war with Israel brought devastation. In Iran, blackouts paralyzed cities. In Israel, tens of thousands fled the north and south. The UN was paralyzed, unable to broker peace amid vetoes and threats. And then, something no one expected began to unfold. Inside Iran, the war had awakened something dangerous, not in Israel, but within its own borders. Economic collapse, military losses, and total isolation reignited long-smoldering fires among Iran's population. Decades of repression, now combined with food shortages and power outages, sparked a new wave of mass protests, larger than the ones in 2009, 2018, or 2022. Women, students, and even former members of the Revolutionary Guard began to demand change. And this time, they were not calling just for reform. They were calling for the end of the regime. The leadership panicked. They had built this war to rally nationalism, but now faced mutiny from within. Desperate to maintain power, Tehran made a quiet, secret request through Russia and Oman. We want a way out. The U.S., seizing the opportunity, offered a deal through backchannels in exchange for halting the war and winding down its nuclear program. Iran would receive partial sanctions, relief, humanitarian aid, and a promise that Israel would stop the airstrikes. There would be no treaty, no handshake, just survival. Israel, bruised but strategically satisfied, having destroyed major Iranian weapons sites, agreed. Suddenly, the rockets stopped, the jets turned around. Hezbollah received a cold order from Tehran: stand down. Militias in Iraq went silent, and Iran's government, on the edge of collapse, issued a vague public statement blaming Western sabotage for the war's toll. While quietly pulling back, the war had no winners, but it didn't end in nuclear fire either. Instead, it ended with a whimper, a fractured Iran on the verge of internal revolution, and an Israel that walked away with a tactical victory, but also with deeper scars, and a region still on edge. Decades from now, when historians look back at the Israel-Iran conflict, they may say it was a miracle. It didn't end in nuclear disaster. The war had all the makings of a regional apocalypse: decades of ideological hatred, nuclear brinkmanship, proxy warfare, and global entanglement. but somehow it stopped short of the edge. And the reason wasn't diplomacy. It was collapse. From within, in books and documentaries, they might call it the war that broke without breaking the world. They'll point to how two of the Middle East's most powerful nations stumbled into open conflict, and how one crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. Iran, long feared for its ambition and proxies, was brought to its knees, not by Israel's missiles, but by its own people. What years of sanctions and cyber attacks couldn't achieve, the regime's own war did. The war exposed the fragility beneath the revolutionary slogans, revealing a population ready to rise, and a leadership too afraid to finish the fight. Israel, for all its tactical brilliance, paid a price to civilians lived in bomb shelters. For weeks, cities were scorched. International sympathy shifted, and while its military emerged as a dominant regional force, its political standing became more complex than ever. Global powers, too, were forced to reconsider their stakes. The U.S. questioned its military commitments. Russia and China rethought their Middle East strategies. Europe saw firsthand the danger of dependency on energy routes near a volatile region. The conflict left no peace agreement, no signatures, and no true resolution. What it left instead was a tense, quiet stalemate, a region on pause, not at peace. In the end, the war didn't end the Israel-Iran rivalry. It froze it, and what history ultimately says may not be about nations or missiles, but about how close we came to the brink and how fragile modern power can be when it faces the unpredictable will of the people.